It's hard to overstate just how significant recent days have been for the people of Northern Ireland, who not only finally have a functioning government back after 2 years of deadlock, but also now have, for the first time, a nationalist First Minister. Michelle O'Neill is from Sinn Fein, a party committed, of course, to uniting Ireland, which she thinks is now a realistic prospect.
So you anticipate a referendum on Irish unity within the next 10 years?
Yes, I believe we're in a decade of opportunity and there are so many things that are changing, all the old norms.
The Sinn Féin leader in the Republic, Mary Lou MacDonald, says a united Ireland is now in touching distance. It would be a seismic move with huge implications for Northern Ireland, the Republic and the United Kingdom. I'm Jonathan Samuels, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, we'll be asking how much closer is a united Ireland now? Later on, we're going to be speaking to two people with different ideas of how quickly that could happen. But first,
Northern Ireland has existed for 103 years.
David Blevins is Sky's senior Ireland correspondent, and he's outside Stormont.
Of course, it was just one island until the partition took place. And in that 103 years, there has never been anyone at the helm of government here who was not a unionist in favour of Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. So Michelle O'Neill, she is now the first nationalist to hold the office of First Minister of Northern Ireland, and that's hugely symbolic. I think it is worth reminding people that the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister share power. They are co-equals, codependent on one another. One does not have more power than the other. So it is practically speaking not that significant, but in terms of the symbolism, it is historic, and symbolism matters in Northern Ireland, and words matter in Northern Ireland, and being able to just use the title First Minister, I think, is momentous when we're talking about a woman who is pursuing her aspiration of Northern Ireland leaving the United Kingdom and becoming part of a united Ireland.
And the public, of course, David, have had years of instability, the last 2 years without government. Are they breathing a sigh of relief, do you think, or when you chat to them, are they sceptical?
Yes, they're breathing a sigh of relief because really politics completely ground to a halt when the power-sharing government collapsed 2 years ago over post-Brexit trading disputes. And since then, we've really limped along in terms of health and education and the economy. Northern Ireland, for example, having the longest waiting lists in the UK in terms of health. So people have been desperate to see some sort of governance here again. I think there is nowhere else in the world apart from Belgium where they've had to go such a long period of time without a functioning government.
And you listed some of the priorities there. One of the main priorities probably isn't the constitutional question, but it's still there, of course. The UK government says a vote on Irish unity is decades away, but the new First Minister says it'll happen in the next 10 years. Who's right, do you think, David?
Depends who you talk to, but the new First Minister in an interview with Sky News was very clear that she absolutely contests the UK government's opinion as expressed in its deal with the DUP that there won't even be the basis for a referendum on Irish unity for, and I quote, decades. Michelle O'Neill said she regarded this as the decade of opportunity. But Jonathan, if we look at that alongside the polling that has been done, in the last significant poll in the Irish Times in 2023, 30% of people in Northern Ireland said they would vote in favour of reunification. 51% said they wouldn't. But as you can see from that, nearly 20% are in the undecided box. And that's people in the middle ground, and I've believed for a very long time that this decision will not be made just by those who vote along nationalist lines or those who vote along unionist lines, but will be made by voters in the middle ground, the moderate voters. And in that same poll, it indicated that 3/5 of people polled in Northern Ireland were in favour of a referendum taking place in 10 years' time. So while they're saying we're not quite ready for this vote now, they are conceding there that in 10 years' time we might be ready for that question to be asked. So to some extent, perhaps that's their determination not to make the same decision Scotland did, to go to a referendum before clearly people were ready for an exit from the United Kingdom.
Let's talk a bit about those specifics then, because you've touched on them, but people will ask about things like the health service. I mean, how could that look?
You would be assuming that the government in Dublin would have to take all decisions in relation to the entire island, although Mary Lou MacDonald has said, at least for a transitional period, she would see some kind of governance still taking place from Stormont. How that would actually work out is not clear, and that's why we're not in a position to have a referendum. The conversation has begun, and the conversation has, I suppose, gathered pace as a result of Brexit. Brexit has focused attention on a border that had become invisible, really, as a result of the Good Friday Agreement, and therefore pushed the question of Northern Ireland's constitutional future front and centre again. Rishi Sunak has some basis for claiming that he's actually the Prime Minister who has finally got Brexit done, because by addressing unionist concerns over the Brexit border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, he has persuaded the DUP to come back into the power-sharing government in Northern Ireland and to some extent turn the page in terms of those negotiations with the EU. And I think there's now a real determination on the part of both London and Dublin to improve relations, get Anglo-Irish relations back to what they were before Brexit.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that young people certainly seem more aligned to Ireland as a nation post-Brexit. But what else do youngsters see in the Republic that perhaps is more attractive to them than it once was?
Traditionally, Northern Ireland has been a much more conservative place. The Democratic Unionist Party has been the lead party of government for 20 years now. It's a party that has its roots in the Free Presbyterian Church founded by the late Reverend Ian Paisley, but it's certainly very conservative around social issues like same-sex marriage and abortion. And the Republic of Ireland has been in a different space around all of those issues for quite some time. We've seen a referendum on same-sex marriage, a referendum on ending the constitutional ban on abortion in the Republic of Ireland. And I have to say, Sinn Fein has been very astute in reading the public mood, particularly the mood among young people, and always has found itself on the right side of those debates just before the referendum has taken place. And so for young people who did not experience the years of violence, even my own grown-up children who were all born after the Good Friday Agreement, grew up in a very different Northern Ireland, and they're perhaps frustrated, if not confused, by the continuing focus on the constitutional question, because for them there are far more important issues to be talking about, especially when you're living through a cost of living crisis.
It is that, isn't it? That there are many priorities in Northern Ireland, many things that people need sorting out because there hasn't been any functioning government for 2 years. And you're saying that the constitutional question, yes, it is important, but it's not at the top of the in tray.
Yes, electorally, I suppose the various parties will continue to talk about what their view is on the constitutional question. Sinn Féin would have to say they're a party seeking reunification to keep their base happy. The DUP would have to say they always regard Northern Ireland as remaining part of the United Kingdom to keep their base happy. But for ordinary people, and especially for the next generation, it's very much about looking ahead. There is a growing number of people in that middle ground. In the last Assembly election, the non-aligned Alliance Party, which does not designate as either Unionist or Nationalist, doubled its representation in the Stormont Assembly, doubled the number of seats it had. And I think that is a very clear indication of the direction of travel for Northern Ireland, and an indication that young people who've grown up with the peace process, have grown up no longer under the shadow of violence, have a determination to see Northern Ireland step away from its past and to achieve the very obvious potential there is for this place, not least the fact that it's the only part of the United Kingdom with dual access to both the GB market and to the EU market as a result of Brexit.
David, thank you very much. Well, in a moment, we'll be getting the views of two people with differing opinions on how the constitutional question might be addressed. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has been meeting leaders of the restored government, and he's asked them to focus on day-to-day issues rather than any potential referendum on a united Ireland. But inevitably, debate about the issue is never far away. Professor Deirdre Heenan is Professor of Social Policy and former Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Ulster University. Brian Feeney is a historian and political columnist with the Irish News. Brian, the UK government says a vote on Irish unity is decades away. The new First Minister says it'll happen in the next 10 years. Who's right, do you think?
It's quite likely it will happen in the next 10 years. There's a growing demand, there's a growing conversation about Irish unity and what it means. And both the British and Irish governments are avoiding the issue. The fact is we are having rapid demographic change here. It's not a static thing where you say, here's the population and that's the way it is. The polls show that 57% of 18 to 25-year-olds favour Irish unity. The big problem is when polls are taken, no one knows what Irish unity means. When they're asked the question, do you favour Irish unity? And people say yes or no. They're saying that for sentimental reasons. They're not based on statistics or rationale. No one knows what we're talking about, whether it's a unitary state, it's a federal state, whether there will still be an assembly in Belfast. What needs to be done is answer questions like that. What's the constitutional system going to look like? And other important questions that polls show people want to know about old age pensions, about national health, about education, a whole series of things, rather like during the run-up to the Scottish referendum and independence, where all those questions were asked, and unfortunately, not all those questions were answered.
Leo Varadkar, Deirdre, a Prime Minister, of course, of a nation with a constitutional claim to Northern Ireland, envisages a referendum in his lifetime. What sort of time frame would you put on it?
Well, he's a fairly young man, so in his lifetime it could be in the next 50 years. I'm not sure. I don't think it's imminent. Mary Lou McDonald talked about it being in touching distance. What does that mean? You know, I don't see it happening within the next 10 years. I really don't. Within the next 25 years, possibly. But I don't see it as imminent. And I think it is important to say that the people here have been through 30 years of the Troubles, long, protracted Brexit negotiations, a global pandemic, a cost of living crisis, and really, in my view, what they're yearning is a period of stability, a period where they can actually say, we have good public services. And really, for me, why we're having this conversation is the constitutional question here was largely settled with the Good Friday Agreement. Everyone knew that we would be here until the majority of people wanted otherwise. But when we talked about border polls or constitutional change, it seemed to be very far in the distance. The real issue for me is that Brexit came along and threw the constitutional jigsaw up in the air, and we don't know where the pieces are going to land. But that kind of settled question was again reopened, and people felt very, very angry about being taken out of the European Union against their will. We voted to remain, and yet we were totally powerless, sat here and watched as a hard Brexit was being negotiated, and we were left without a government.
Do you think that's the reason then that young people, 57% of the sort of rising generation of 18 to 24-year-olds do favour unification then? Is that why?
I teach young people. I had a class this morning and I often ask them about their identity, and constitutional questions come up all of the time when we're in class. And it is important to say, if you ask someone, do they want Irish unity? Ask someone, do they want world peace? What does it actually mean to them, and how much time do they spend thinking about it? It is important to say that in Northern Ireland, we are no longer two tribes of unionists and nationalists. There's a growing middle ground that means we are actually three minorities.
That's not true.
It is true.
80% of people vote Republican or unionist?
I am simply saying 50% of the population here do not vote. Why do they not go out and vote if they're so exercised about their identity? If they were truly exercised about their identity and Irish unity, or indeed their British identity, they would be out voting, and they are not voting. There's a really important point here. What we learned from the Brexit experience is people are going to be very reluctant to vote for anything until they have an evidence base that says, well, what will my health service look like? You're asking me to leave the National Health Service, which is free at the point of delivery, something that is highly valued in Northern Ireland, regardless of what your identity is or your constitutional persuasion. You're asking me to leave this behind and join a different system. We have our politicians being allowed to say, you know, if only we had an all-island health service, that would be a panacea and we wouldn't have waiting lists. There's absolutely no evidence to support this. I'm not saying if it's right or if it's wrong, but I think if we are going to have a serious, engaged conversation, it needs to be based on evidence, not people's ideas.
That's the very first point I made, that nobody knows what Irish unity means. So you've got to answer these questions, and who can answer them except the government? The Irish government is very reluctant to get involved in this because it will mean changing everything, and they don't want to do it.
If you put aside, Brian, ideology and identity and politics, people in Northern Ireland, especially those younger people, what is it, do you think, across the border that appeals to them?
Well, I think there are a number of things. One of them, and Deirdre has made this point, one of them is they get back into the European Union. But that's quite clear, looking across the border, salaries are higher, life expectancy is longer, the education system is better. It's a pluralist society. There is not the sort of tribal stuff that you get here. So people, particularly young people, feel deprived by the Brexit vote, and they don't want to be attached to a declining Britain.
I think Brian's right. The issue here that we have to address is change. Change has happened and change is going to happen. When I was at school, and I like to think it wasn't that long ago, the received wisdom was that the Republic of Ireland was backward, that it was a backwater, that it was an economic basket case, and it was controlled by the Catholic Church. Now we look to the Republic of Ireland and see a cosmopolitan, confident European city, and it looks like we're the people that's been left behind. Then for the unionist tradition, their raison d'etre was to protect the British identity and protect British culture. But the idea that they have about British identity and British culture has changed radically. Go over to a city such as Birmingham or Manchester. It's not what's depicted here as Britishness. It isn't about waving the Union Jack and ideas about the royal family. Britain has become multicultural. Things are moving rapidly. Ideas and social norms are changing. And that will all play into the mix about what the future looks like.
Let's just talk about something else in the future. And what impact could the general election in the Republic of Ireland, Brian, have on the unification question? I mean, we could see, couldn't we, a Sinn Fein leader on both sides of the border?
Well, that's what Sinn Fein want, obviously. First of all, if that were to happen, in the short term, there's a North-South Ministerial Council. And that would mean, for example, a Sinn Fein minister from the south sitting across the table from a Sinn Fein minister in the north. And you could end up having a national policy on something like education, or even a national policy on something like health. So in the short term, it would make an enormous difference. If there were to be a Sinn Féin Taoiseach, say there's a coalition between Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil, Sinn Féin will be demanding that the Irish government produce a green paper on Irish unity and lay down the sort of stuff I've been talking about. What type of Ireland would it be? What would a united Ireland mean? And answers to the sort of questions both Deirdre and I have been asking about the health service, about education, about pensions, and all the rest of it. So there would be a rapid lurch forward on the issue of whether or not there is a referendum on Ireland. And Sinn Féin have said that they would like to see it by 2030.
Deirdre?
Well, I agree. I think if we had Sinn Féin North and South, we shouldn't underestimate the symbolic significance of that. the psychological significance for people on both sides of the border who would suddenly see that the landscape had changed radically. And we have had a government in the south at the moment who have been very reluctant to talk about anything that would be deemed to be upsetting to the constitutional balance here. I think you would have people saying, well, if it's okay to have a command paper that is 80 pages of talking about how much unionists mean to the union, why isn't it okay to at least have the discussion about Irish unity? Even at the moment, people are saying, you shouldn't be discussing this.
I was really struck by how the First Minister and Deputy First Minister were very respectful in their opening speeches over the weekend, talking about embracing difference and respecting all communities. But I guess the reality is, whether you're a British unionist or an Irish Republican, it may be peaceful, but it is still a contested place. Deirdre, do you think the unity question could be the one issue that does threaten the stability of Stormont more than anything else as we go forward?
No, I don't. I think Brexit is still the destabilising issue. And when we get to any real changes around divergence in trade, issues that are deemed to affect the British identity, issues that may strengthen the border in the Irish Sea, the fact that we may have a Labour government. So there are many, many destabilising issues long before we get to the issue of unity. We cannot keep continuing with this very unstable form of government. So I think it is really incumbent on both governments to say, how do we inject some stability into the process where we can have a more normalised form of democracy, that we are focused on policy and delivering policy objectives, not arguments about identity.
Yeah, in the immediate term, Brexit remains the big issue, and the DUP is still badly split on whether or not to accept the deal last week. Something like 50% of the party executive just voted in favour of it, and just about the MPs are split. So it is a huge divisive issue within the DUP.
So, right now, the people of Northern Ireland want their politicians to focus on public services, health, the cost of living crisis, jobs. It's a long list, isn't it? Well, the Good Friday Agreement says a united Ireland can happen if there's a wish either side of the border for a referendum. The people of Northern Ireland and the Republic would both have to vote for it. While support continues to rise, as we've been hearing, for now the focus for most is on results rather than rhetoric over something which may or may not happen years down the line. That's it from the Sky News Daily. We'll be back tomorrow.